Good evening and welcome to the Obelisk. How is everybody doing tonight? No answer? All right.
Yeah, very good on my end. Yeah, doing great.
Sorry, I had to unmute.
Yeah. Talking about me fucking up every week, huh?
I'm used to Nux Mente, where you bring in the whole.
I know. I'll start doing it that way.
I'll never.
It's a rhetorical question for the audience, so I don't actually expect a response, but it's nice to get one. Anyway, tonight's guest, we have Phoenix Aurelius. Phoenix has been a practitioner of alchemy for over 15 years and is an instructor for over a decade. Known as the Modern Renaissance Man, Phoenix possesses an ability to communicate complex and vast ideas using concise language. Being a pioneer in his field, Phoenix feels that alchemy is more timely and relevant than ever before and is passionate about people learning and assimilating the information into their daily lifestyles. He sees alchemy and cosmo-mimicry as the key to transpersonal psychology, sound sociology, and healthy ecology, and thus teaches alchemy from that perspective. He is the VP of Research and Development for Niyama, where he develops Spagyric Formulations to meet the demands of the modern world. Phoenix, so happy to have you on the show tonight.
Hey, thanks so much. I really appreciate you inviting me to be on.
Yeah, it's a great honor. You're a big name in the world, in my world at least, as far as alchemy is concerned and what you've brought forth. So
cool. Well, that's really good to hear that. Those are some very kind accolades in my opinion. So thank you. Yeah, I feel honored.
I was just today I was making some orders. I ordered from Nance's site I love his stuff, and so I reordered, and then I went on over to your site, and so actually off the bat I was curious about thyroiditis, stuff for thyroid, Hashimoto's. I see you have a thyroid option in there. What would you suggest for people dealing with those kinds of issues with the endocrine system, but in particular thyroiditis?
Yeah, so on a scale from 1 to 10, how technical and in depth do you want me to be right now?
Well, for me, since I've been deep into this for a long time, you can go to 10, but I don't know about the audience. So maybe we should settle in a 5.
Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, so basically Hashimoto's can be caused by a wide range of different things, according to all of the research that I've done and the case studies that I've done. In fact, I'm working with a woman. I'm working with a couple of people who have Hashimoto's, but one in particular that we have medically confirmed through tests, third-party tests with her medical physicians, that all of her thyroid antibodies are 95% eliminated now. So they were extremely terrible, and now they've seen a 95% decrease, meaning that she's actually out of the range of having Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So thyroid disorders, the thyroid is an endocrine organ that's in the neck. And basically it governs over the production of hormones and the release of hormones for a wide range of different things. I mean, everything from like sleep to digestion to communicating downstream with the thymus for immune function and so on. And it also communicates with the pancreas. And so oftentimes you'll see people with Hashimoto's also having carbohydrate metabolism disorders, specifically from stuff due to gluten. And that translates to the MTHFR C677T genes. I've got a damn fly in here, so if I swat, that's what I'm going for.
You're
At
not
any rate,
buddy. Join the
actual
club.
Cam.
yeah, exactly. No pets on the show. So what I have ended up finding is that the thyroid itself usually is not something that really needs to be looked at. There's really two factors when people have Hashimoto's. The first is that the hypothalamus or the pituitary or both, but usually the hypothalamus has some sort of disruption, either heavy metal congestion or some sort of trauma to the hypothalamus, you know, blunt force trauma, falling down, hitting your head, things like that, that actually inhibits signals, hormones, et cetera, from being able to travel downstream and relate to the pituitary, which will then relate with the thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, pancreas, and eventually the adrenals, in order to create that whole axis that's called the HPA axis. So what I've seen is that you actually have to go upstream from the thyroid, and you have to take a look at the hypothalamus and hypothalamus health. Secondly, Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disorder, actually. And what's happening is that typically, one of the theories, and when the thing that IDF data on my end is showing, is that physiologically, when people have Hashimoto's, what's ending up happening is that their body has developed some sort of antibody to a protein that's inside of wheat or gluten-based materials, or gluten-containing materials, rather. And I'm trying to think of the name of that. I want to call it gliadin, but I'm not 100% certain that that's it. I would have to pull that up after the show or on a break or something. But at any rate, this particular protein chain is so similar to the protein chains, the amino acids that compose the thyroid gland, that once all of that wheat or gluten-containing material and all of the gliadin or whatever the name of that protein is that gets broken down, once that's out of the body's antibodies are still producing antibody that ends up attacking the thyroid. And so this is where certain hormones that the thyroid is meant to produce actually get inhibited or thrown out of balance or start producing too much. So a lot of people think, oh, I've got thyroid problems, I can just take some iodine, or I can just take Bladder-Wrack and get rid of it. It's really a little bit more complex than that, because every autoimmune condition really comes down to three things. First, there's a trigger event, but then the trigger event is directed primarily by genes. So like if you have the MTHFR 6677 or 677T alleles, or any of these other types of variations, then that is something that you really need to just be aware of, because the genes themselves don't create a sensitivity. It's that they direct the trigger event. And then the third thing that has to be in place, because a trigger event won't trigger autoimmunity unless your immune system's already overburdened and overtaxed. And 90% of the time or more in my clients, what we see is intestinal hyperpermeability or leaky gut.
Yes.
And so it's those three things that I have found that lead to autoimmune conditions on a physiological level. But then behind that, there's the Chinese medicine level of the etheric body and the meridians and so on and so forth.
Yes.
The triple warmer meridian relates very heavily to the entire endocrine system, as does conception vessel and governing vessel to a larger degree, or a smaller degree as well. But the largest component of it is triple warmer meridian. And then behind that, there's also ancestrale, the cause of disease due to planets. And so I find that if people have Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, either of those or all of those out of balance, then they're actually very heavily at risk for developing Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So I'm still far enough away from the finish line that I can't tell you, oh, everybody that has Hashimoto's has ancestrale, but what I can say is all of the people that I've worked on so far that have Hashimoto's do have that cause of disease in common. So whether that's going to be across the board or not remains to be seen, though.
This is fascinating, and also I think promising with your work in this. What protocols did you use? What of your particular elixirs, your particular stuff did you give your lady client to deal with this particular issue, the Hashimoto's?
Yeah. So, she's in Australia, And so it takes a long time to get things from here to there. But I think when she first started working with us, we tried, bladder rack, we tried protemia, which balances out an entire host of monoamine neurotransmitters that, change brain chemistry in the hypothalamus. And hopefully then, that impacts things downstream. We've also tried heavy metal detoxing to get the heavy metals out of the hypothalamus. And so I've got a formula called Heavy Metal Detox Formula RX. And that's the one that we use for her. So we've done a couple of things that way, but we noticed actually very, very marginal results in the spagyric approach for that particular client. And that seems to be true with the other clients that I have that have Hashimoto's as well. It doesn't seem like any particular spagyrics or set of herbs, at least from a Western perspective, like this herb is good for this, or this alters this chemical constituent. We haven't been able to find anything like that. There are Chinese medicine approaches of formulations, but then that takes a diagnosis from a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner to be able to find out what the particular imbalance is, because in Chinese medicine, 12 different people can go in with Hashimoto's and get 12 entirely different diagnoses of what the root cause of that is for them. So with that being said, the herbs that need to be applied are different for every person, and it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. So what I've done actually is do IDF balancing broadcasts and research with my research clients and investigations. And it seems to be that that's really the main, especially to start off with Enzastrale, the cause of disease due to the planets and stars. That's where we really have to start, because unless we clear that out, the chain of command from the subtle energy body into the physical body goes spiritual, causal, astral. Etheric is actually just a halfway point between the astral and then the physical. So the etheric body is really just a halfway point. Paracelsus used to call that the archaeus, but that's where Ayurveda and Chinese medicine and other things like that, that's where they really kick in.
Yeah, I love the TCM and the Ayurveda. This has been a long path for me, but it seems like there's an epidemic of endocrine and autoimmune stuff going on across the globe, really, but definitely in the Western world. And of course, it looks to me premeditated, if you want to say that, like by design. And so, yeah. Oh, we should definitely go there.
I'd like to discuss that chain of command you just went over. But first, I have things to read. You guys took off without me.
Oh, sorry, Jared. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. Just step all over me. I don't give a shit. I'm kidding.
Don't bring out the Dom in me.
Back up on it, baby.
Me with a good time.
Don't even get me started. I wanted to thank our latest patron, whatever the hell it is, Christy Mesmer. Thank you for signing up.
Thank you, Christy.
Yes, we love you. I wanted to read about the corn moon. Tonight, there's a moon. It's rising right now in front of me. I can see it. It's the first time in 3 years the September moon is in a unique situation. It's happening so early in the month, a timing that gives it an entirely different name, which is the corn moon instead of a harvest moon. It sets the stage for October, when we'll have 2 full moons, which means there'll be a rare blue moon at the end of October on Halloween. How weird is that? So this full,
cool.
It is cool. This full moon is named for the East Coast corn harvest. Reach a peak tonight at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time. Tomorrow, never tonight. Anyway, that's all I had to read.
And our corn yields have failed because of course, I think weaponized weather. Yes, and so, traditionally, I talked about this with Montana Jordan and Solaris Blue Raven on
your other show.
Yeah, on one of them. And it was, I know so many. But yeah, so traditionally there would be some sort of a sacrifice now that we're in the second harvest and the crops have failed. And instead of the old school gods, it's the new gods, right? It's the new weaponized technological gods that have laid waste to our food stores and given us terrible crop yields because of very strange weather events.
Because of reasons.
Yes. So traditionally, there would be a sacrifice to appease that energetic wave or those gods, and prayers and all that go with it to try and balance what was an imbalance to get the next season's crops to grow. It's almost like we're living in the original Wicker Man,
but not
the 72
sacrificing
version.
Yeah.
apparently. So anyway, so you guys kind of geeked out there on health stuff, and I had no idea what you're talking about. So
Yeah, we'll reel it back in.
I was wondering if you could like just lay some groundwork here for what Spagyric is, how you use it in your work, or it is basically your work, but how it relates to alchemy, if it's the same thing, or how it's subtly different, and how it relates to your work and what you do.
Yeah, brilliant stuff, man. Okay, so we'll start at ground floor. Okay, we'll talk about alchemy first, because Spagyric was born out of the alchemical tradition. In the West, so India has its own alchemical tradition, and today that's still alive. That's known as Rasa Shastra. We also have Taoist alchemy, where they were actually smelting metals in 3 different cauldrons, and doing all these really interesting sublimations of materials. And they created mercury sulfides and all sorts of other things that are pretty unique all the way across the board: Western alchemy, Indian alchemy, Chinese alchemy. Different approaches, different cultural approach for sure, different context also for how they explain the work. But the tradition of alchemy that I really have followed and studied really intensely is the Western esoteric tradition of alchemy and the Western alchemical path. Particularly, my branch is that of Paracelsus, but alchemy came along many, many thousands of years before Paracelsus, and it started with probably Mesopotamians, and moved into Egypt and into Greece as a result of that, and then eventually the Moors, the Muslims who took over Egypt, got all of that information, and then they moved into Spain and up into Europe, and that's when Western alchemy really, as like a European tradition, came to be known that way. So all of those share a very lineated source, though, and for the most part, the oldest texts that we have about alchemy really go back to the Muslim writings. There is one piece of information that is Egyptian that was translated into Arabic and then translated into the European languages and comes to us today, and that's called the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. And this is pretty much like the cornerstone of all alchemical literature. And in that, it tells us that alchemy is the operation of the sun. And it also says that this is the greatest force of all forces because it overcomes every subtle thing and penetrates every solid thing. So the way that people tend to perceive alchemy today is that it's a Western alchemist, typically what we would call a puffer or a souffleur in French, and huddling over his chemistry set, trying to turn lead into gold. And most people think that either alchemy was this vain science of turning lead into gold, or that everything that they wrote about, they encrypted very heavily with physical materials and imagery, and they were actually working archetypes, and that's Jungian kind of psychology for you right there. The truth of it is that alchemy is an entirely comprehensive system that incorporates the soul, the spirit, and body into everything. And that's only as of Paracelsus. Paracelsus was the first one to say that soul, spirit, and body, or what we call sulfur, mercury, and salt, respectively, in the alchemical tradition, that all 3 of those exist. Before him, there was an Arabic guy named Al-Jabir, and he said that sulfur, mercury exists, and he was playing with sublimations of metals. And somehow they didn't, they had powdered materials that they were working with. They had ashes. They knew how to do all the processes with the salts, but they never considered the salts a salt in and of themselves. And it was Paracelsus saying, hey, listen, like there's sulfur, there's mercury, and there's salt. And if you put them all together, then, now you really have something that's alive. Because if you just have body and spirit, there's no soul to that material. It might be breathing, but it's not going to be animated, so to speak. And so that's kind of the concept that Paracelsus came up with, that everything has a soul, a spirit, and a body. And
does it have anything to do with homunculi?
Well, yeah, like a homunculi can't come to life unless you have soul, spirit, and body inside of there too. So yeah, for anybody who's interested in actually reading about people who have practically undertaken the homunculus work, I suggest reading the biography that Mark Stavish did of Dr. Joseph Liszewski.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's got some of the best information in that about the heartbreaks and the actual realities of creating homunculi. And so, yeah. Anyway, so, alchemy really is the set of patterns that can be followed, or a set of processes, rather, that can be followed in any number of ways, all myriad different ways, really, to be able to either exalt and or transform matter, spirit, and body all together, and to be able to raise the octave of its existence in a certain way when you put it all back together. So the concept is that you take out the soul, you take out the spirit, you take out the body of a material, you perfect each of those in their own right, and then you combine them back together and allow them to digest and to be able to work on one another. And by the time you're done, you have something that's noticeably no longer noticeable as the starting material that you started working on. And so alchemy's laws and principles aren't just allegorical for spiritual terms. We're seeing, when we work in the laboratory, we're seeing the spirit, the body, and the soul at the same time. We're working on those aspects of ourselves. So the soul would be like your psychological aspect. Your spirit is going to be your discipline and your physical energy levels, your chi, so to speak, in Chinese medicine. And then you're also going to have your actual physical projects that you're working on, the physical material. And we're constantly dissecting all three of those planes all at once. And we feel that only by, as alchemists, we feel that only by really performing this work do you get to see nature's inner processes really exposed to you in such a way that you would understand how nature works and how nature is constantly transforming and all those things. So everything that we do as alchemists is all derived 100% from nature and natural processes. And then what we do is we take it in a small scale and we work with it in the lab and catalyze it in very particular ways in order to not only see what it does, but in order to be able to find out what the spiritual and psychological correlations or corollaries are between the work that we're seeing physically and what we're processing internally. And that can happen with metals, and it can happen with herbs, and it can happen with water. So the concept of transmuting metals really that's one pathway, and not necessarily the highest pathway either.
There's a lot. Sorry, Jared, go.
No, in some ways that the idea of turning lead to gold is metaphorical.
Yeah, it's very metaphorical, and it is part of the alchemical corpus of works. And some, depending on your pathway, some would even say the pinnacle of being able to show that you have mastered nature's processes as intimately as nature herself has mastered those processes. But that's really all that work should be undertaken for. And just like with the sages of old, it's like those who say don't know and those who know don't say. Like, if you're undertaking the work or if you're working on it really seriously, you typically don't say a whole lot about it. And it's not something that you brag about. It's not the money that you're after and, all these other things. So
it's by internal the time work.
Yeah, exactly. By the time you get to that point in actually creating the Philosopher's Stone, you typically have a sense of peace and knowledge and wisdom from all of the other work that you've undertaken, that, the vanity of it all is completely removed and it's just a test.
Can you explain that aspect of the Philosopher's Stone for our audience?
Which aspect would that be?
Whatever you just said.
Yeah.
Finding this Philosopher's Stone, I think you said.
Well, just do it. I feel like, I don't know what the audience has said, but perhaps to approach the Philosopher's Stone from
a newbie,
synthesizing all the information into, so the general idea that the public has about the Philosopher's Stone from, say, media and movies and all that, like in the Harry Potter stuff.
From Harry Potter to reality.
Right. Well, and then through the psychological stuff, through the Jungian stuff, and down into the physical work of the material, where I guess the facets of it, the processes of the stone itself, of the work itself.
Sure, yeah. So there's really multiple pathways to go about creating everything in alchemy. There's at least two pathways. One would be called via humida, which means the wet way, which uses chemical solvents and menstrua to be able to break things down and dissolve them and precipitate them out, so on and so forth. And then there's also via secca, which means the dry way. So there's typically those two main paths. But then within those, there are also subcategories and lots of different ways of approaching the work, because again, it's really based in principle, not necessarily direct methodology. But the pathway that I am the most familiar with is Via Secca, specifically the Flamel path of the Via Secca as taught by Jean Dubuis and elaborated upon by a couple of other people. And so basically what in the laboratory, you're working with metals at this point, because you're working on transmuting things inside of the metallic kingdom. You're working on a substance that will ultimately be able to transform lead into gold, or baser metals in general into gold. And the way that the Philosopher's Stone is created on a practical level is by taking various oxides of antimony and a few other flux agents and iron shot, and being able to create an ingot of antimony and iron ore, basically, that and oxides that end up turning into like this nice little ingot. And then once you have smelted that and it won't absorb any more iron, then we actually add copper and we add silver. So it becomes what's called as a lunar, which means silver, Venusian, which means copper. And again, these correlate to the planet. So Luna is, corresponds to silver, Venus corresponds to copper, and then Martial corresponds to iron, and then the Regulus, the little king, which corresponds to antimony. And so you end up creating what's called a lunar Venusian Martial Regulus. And once you have that, then you have to prepare your philosophical mercury. And what you do is you take actual metallic mercury and put it in a miner's retort. You drop in your lunar Venusian Martial Regulus, and you let it dissolve, because mercury dissolves most metals. It dissolves gold and all these other things. And when you distill out the mercury, now you have like one big chunk. This used to be a common miner's trick. They would actually take little bits of the ore that wasn't enough, like little dusts and things that still had a fair bit of gold in them, but they would throw all of the main rock into the mining barrel in order to go out to the company, but they'd take little bits of this dust and keep it for them. They'd build these little miners' retorts and, get little bits of gold. And, after 20 years of working in a mine, for instance, you've got a nice little chunk there. So that being said, you put the lunar Venusian Martial Regulus inside of the metallic mercury, and you distill the mercury, and this is known as flying the eagles. And so you do 7 distillations where the mercury has dissolved the ingot, you distill the mercury out, the ingot reforms, and then you take that, you purify it again, drop it back in the mercury, and distill the mercury again. So those are called cohobations, and you do 7 cohobations of that, which is known as flying the eagles. And that prepares the work for what's called philosophical mercury. And particularly, that's the philosophical mercury of Via Secca Flamel path. Then what you do is you have to take the seed of gold. And you can prepare the seed of gold a wide number of ways, including from what's called the scoria, which is kind of the waste from making the lunar Venusian Martial Regulus. There's some waste on it, especially when you're doing the first couple of pullings with the iron. And so what ends up happening is that you have this like black charred looking material. It's pretty easy to grind up and break up with a hammer. You can extract the seed of gold out of that, or you can actually take it from native gold or any source really that's 24 karat or higher. But native gold is preferred, or work the poor man's path, which is called working with the scoria. And once you take the seed of gold, then you have seed and you have a menstruum. and you can literally impregnate that menstruum with the seed of gold. And what ends up happening is some very realistic color changes that happen as you incubate this in a hermetically sealed environment for a long time. The heat is just high enough that it's catalyzing various principles and various chemical constituencies inside of there. So like you might see it, you know, putting off these weird dark fumes for a little while, or putting out white fumes after you incubate it, you know, after the black phase, and then eventually turning into the red phase, and so on and so forth. And the actual substance goes from more or less a liquid mercury into like darker material, and at one point it will turn green and have orange flowers on it. And you know, there's a number of different elucidations for how the philosopher's stone looks as you continue to incubate it. So eventually though, what ends up happening is that the entire substance will turn red. In some accounts, you grow a tree in there, like there's this little spindly looking tree thing that grows these tiny little red, what look like red fruits hanging from the tree branches. And then those will fall down, and then eventually everything will start to turn red after that. But the whole process takes, you know, anywhere between 1 to 2 years just to get it to a point of incubation where you're going to be seeing any phase of reddening like this. And for some people that I know, it's been up to 6 years that they've been at it and just continually incubating. So there's not a lot of peer review on this yet in terms of how can we standardize the methodology, perform this, use this material, this heat, you know, so on and so forth. So there's different variables that cause people to get slightly different results. But then once you have that red material, then it has to, if you want to use it for transmutation of the metals, you have to undergo 2 more processes of what are called multiplication and then projection. And then you can take a small amount of that substance, wrap it inside of beeswax, drop it into a baser metal. Lead is really awesome because you can heat it up and melt it really easily, just like with a candle usually. And so you don't need very high heat to melt it. And that's why that one is so, and it's dirt cheap. So that's why that one is typically used. But you can use all sorts of different baser metals. A lot of people would use mercury back in the day, especially in the European texts, because it was more available than it is now. And so that's an actual physiological process that I'm familiar with of creating the philosopher's stone. I've heard about other different pathways like in the Splendor Solis and other things like that of doing the wet work, but I've not seen it diagrammed out in such a way that I can speak to that authoritatively.
So mercury is an interesting metal. Is it? I'm asking. I don't know. Is it mined or created?
No, mercury is mined. Yeah, there's actual veins of mercury that, and technically, what ends up happening is that you get cinnabar rock and cinnabar and different other types of mercury minerals contain mercury inside of it, from which the metallic mercury can be refined.
But it's always a liquid, right? It's always in that liquid state. So I guess a vein of it wouldn't be like a pool. If you broke through a rock wall, would like a pool of mercury flow out ever, or is it all locked within the rocks?
You know, as far as I know, it's locked within the rocks, but there might be veins, or you know, I'm not 100% certain on the mining aspect, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting. The one thing I couldn't help thinking about while you're talking about all the processes involved with, you were just going through all the things in the Spagyria and the alchemical process. I just kept thinking, oh, this is magic. You're doing a ritual. It's all very ritualistic. The protocols.
It is very ritualistic, yeah. You know, here's what I'm trying to say. Jean Dubuis said in his works that alchemy was the only path of the Western esoteric tradition that you can't actually delude yourself with whether the ritual worked or not, because you have a physical counterpart. It's not just psychological. It's not just in your head. It's not just spiritual within the feeling of your body. It is, or the feelings that are subtle, not in the body, you know, however you want to describe that. But it actually has a physical counterpart too. And so if the ritual is successful, then you end up with the material that does exactly what the ancient masters would have told you that it did. And so in that form, I feel that it's a prerequisite to work with, to understand the principles and the processes before working with theurgy, which is a form of magic that works with not necessarily controlling, but commanding would be a better term, various unseen spirits or forces.
Demons.
And fair enough. Yeah, angels and demons, actually.
Same thing.
But, yeah, exactly. All Clefothic. So yeah, that's basically the whole concept, though. And I think that a lot of people actually had that experience. Like Israel Regardie would have said that, because he did study with Frater Albertus and did study alchemy at the Paracelsus Research Society here in Utah before he died. And in fact, that's how he ended up dying. He was working on making the lunar Venusian martial regulus, and he breathed in the smoke from doing that process. It's called feeding the black dragon. And you take these big scoopfuls of antimony oxide and flux agents and stick them inside, and iron too, iron shot, and you stick them inside of a crucible that's being heated around a furnace at about 900 to 1100 degrees Celsius. And as soon as you do that, there's an actual detonation that happens, and a huge plume of smoke goes into the air.
Like Beirut.
And, say that again?
Like in Beirut.
Yeah, like in Beirut, exactly. Only on a much smaller scale.
Right.
And yeah, what ends up happening is sometimes the wind blows, and Robert Bartlett always used to joke around, and he would say, "Yeah, it's a good time to practice your pranayama."
But be sure to wear your mask, everyone.
Yeah, hell, wear a good chemical respirator, or really good ventilation. Like that work is serious stuff.
It's
you know, when you
serious.
get somebody like Israel Regardie, who was very serious, very determined, very focused, very safe in his approach to the work, and then ended up hurting himself. That's just a testament to how anybody can do it. No matter how safe you think you are, there's probably also one more step that you should consider.
We were talking about how it's like almost a perfect outcome if you do it right. I read a book by, was it Dr. Stephen Skinner? Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah, of course.
So he wrote that book about the PGM, the Greek papyri.
Yeah.
And he tested all the spells in there, and they all worked. When he did it properly, they all worked. And his conclusion was that this is a science. Doing these spells, this magic in a certain way, the proper way, and then he wrote a book actually laying out all the spells and the proper way to do them, and then his notes on it. But he did each one over 50 times, and he came to the conclusion that this is a science. It all works if you do it right. And what you're describing is just a different physical set of rules and laws that we can use to do these rituals, this physical magic, if you will. I don't know, it's real interesting. One more thing, and then I'll shut up. You're talking about Paracelsus, and I was wondering if you ever saw the TV show Warehouse 13.
No, I've never seen that.
Okay, it was a sci-fi show years ago. I think it had 5 or 6 seasons. Doesn't matter. In the later episodes, they... I forget exactly how it happened. They had a time machine of some sort, or they went back in time, and H.G. Wells turns out to be a woman and comes to the future and starts fucking around with everything. She's like trying to destroy it. But she brings Paracelsus back.
Interesting.
I think it was like 3 or 4 shows, and he starts to rain havoc. He makes this potion that makes people zombies. It was great.
That's great. So he created the new COVID vaccine.
Yeah, pretty much. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up because I thought that was interesting. And
yeah, that is actually really interesting. Yeah, I have heard of that show. I've never seen it though. So, but you just have sparked an interest in me that says, I need to check at least those couple of episodes out. Yeah, Paracelsus was rad though, man. Like for people who don't know, I mean, he was healing leprosy, plagues, syphilis, obstructive disorders, what we now call intestinal viruses or flus. He was healing like all of this stuff in the 1500s just flawlessly, so much so that he was very insistent, sometimes even annoyingly so to his contemporaries, that he knew more about medicine and could actually demonstrate it than anybody else. And in a time where you didn't have social media or other things, they just barely had like some news bulletins, and it wasn't standardized all over Europe. You could really only publish books. And so he would write books and tell people as much as he possibly could and try and get students at the universities and things like that. But he would try and tell people, listen, I've got a much better method, and you really got to listen to this and check this out, because I'll show you how we can heal these things. And people of the time were so caught in their conventions, which sounds so much like it still does today, not much has changed, that when you say, hey, I've really figured something else out that really works and let me demonstrate it for you, they really want to make you fail, and they want to try and criticize you as much as possible in order to berate you, because it means that they would have to learn from scratch again, and they're typically pretty high on the hog with their current degrees and titles and so on and so forth.
Of course.
And so for me, he was kind of like the epitome of a medical rebel who was able to really find things that worked, and be able to say, listen, I'm willing to prove exactly what I know. In fact, they actually had him do just that. They put him into a colony of lepers one time when he said, listen, I've healed leprosy and blah blah blah, and they were like, you healed leprosy? Okay, big shot.
Pixar, it didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. And so he went into an entire colony of lepers and healed them all, except for a couple of them who were already beyond a point where they could be healed. They were at a very critical stage. All the rest of the lepers walked out completely healed, much to the dismay of all of the doctors who had taunted him and told him that he couldn't do so. And he figured out that you could heal most bacterial diseases actually through a concept of taking that person's own feces in a tiny little bread pill. So he would take a little pin and take their feces and then stick that pin into a little piece of bread and roll it up into a pill and just have them swallow it.
Yeah.
And that was kind of like taking, because your digestive system and all of the tract is actually getting rid of the negative bacteria that are in there, and colonizing with proper bacteria. And the way he looked at things is that it's not that you need to kick things out of the system so much, it's that they came there because there was an imbalance. They're growing because there's an imbalance. So if you put the right bacteria back in the system again in just a small enough way, with a probiotic and prebiotic structure, like tiny little amount of feces inside of the prebiotic of the bread, done, and it will bring people back into balance. So yeah, he saved so many kings and queens and princes and stuff like that, and they refused to pay him. The one case in particular where they refused to pay him, it was just like his life was just one series of him trying to prove himself to the rest of the world, even though he was light years ahead of the rest of the world. Always have to deal with the adversity of the people of his time, and in so many ways I experienced very similar.
Yeah, you're pushing forward.
Yeah, and that idea of fecal transplants has been in the news lately too. I mean, I heard about it last year from John Hopkins, I think. I don't remember.
Yeah, exactly. They're coming around 600 years later to the same things that he said they wrote about very definitely in the 1530s. So, yeah.
Well, even with the idea of modern day materialists that and lay their coats, everything science, and yet they're so adhered or strapped down or bound to the conventional science that they are unable to see how to move forward. And as you know, the process is taking what has been learned and pushing forward, but those that runs against the currents of finances, that runs against the currents of the clique at hand that is having control over these theories.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, this is some of the great work you're doing, actually, pushing this forward and getting peer reviewed and all that.
Yeah, it's one hell of a push, let me tell you that, because the powers that be and the people who finance medical studies they don't want to touch this type of research with the 10-foot pole, because they know that their financiers also are the people who are in the pharmaceutical industry or are the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma itself. And when you take a look at the the grants that are given, you take a look at all of the studies and even scientists that are paid, medical scientists to study virology and all these other things. It's a very, very tight-knit group economically. You can trace it back to just a couple of financing organizations. And so,
Yes.
and they're also funding the schools and the universities. And so even university grants and things like that, they don't want anything to do with this type of research, because then it's not feeding them on the back end with, okay, now we have a form of medicine that we can make, we can mass produce it through synthesization, we can get it out, and now it's a financial model, because at the end of the day, they're just looking for an ROI. They just want their return.
Yep.
And so with research like this, I've relied on the public who values these things to be able to bring it forward. It's like Buckminster Fuller said, it's like, you can't try and change a system from the inside out. You have to create a new system that makes the old one obsolete. And the pathway that I'm trying to take is trying to get other people very interested in this work and being able to finance it themselves, because it doesn't take a whole lot of money, to be perfectly honest. If the entire world could fund maybe 50 to 100 alchemists in total, with a good enough structure and a plan ahead of time, we would be able to vet a lot of concepts out and be able to help return the world to a very, very sustainable state of balance if people would listen to the demonstrations, not the published science. Okay, that's cute. Published science is cute, don't get me wrong, but it's demonstrations. The proof is in the pudding. And when people can actually demonstrate time after time with reproducibility, here is what, here's the techniques, here are the methodologies, here's what to do, I feel like the world would be in a drastically different place. So that's the system that I'm trying to create and trying to foster and cultivate as best as I possibly can. Because what's true is, regardless of who's financing things, public decision also has an equal weight to financing in terms of what is popular or what is pushed on society. And if people demand that something goes into place, it doesn't matter what the financiers really want, they're going to end up financing it, because that's just where the people are. If that's where the money's to be made, that's where they go, so.
Yeah, there's always a great push though with those people that are held fast. As I was saying earlier, I was wondering, kind of winding way back, do you feel that psychology co-opted the idea of alchemy?
Oh yeah.
In particular, I love Jung, and he did wonderful work and was talking from the real. I believe we're not talking about the cult of Jung. Definitely, we're talking about Jung and his work, because there's a big separation there. Talk about the Negredo. Anyway, so there's a big separation that it's been co-opted, and I've heard it my entire life that alchemy is a philosophical, metaphysical process, and yet the way I understand it is all these systems work together, and there's a synthesis, and the real alchemists that have always been working at it are coming at it from this angle. We've got the physical world, we've got the fixed sulfur, calcination, the salt, the body, right? All this, along with the spirit and the soul, with the sulfur and the mercury, all this stuff coming together, just like the bodies, the outer bodies, the physical body, the spiritual body, the nervous body, all this. And when you say psychology and alchemy today, that's pretty much what people think. The rest of it's hogwash.
Yeah, well, hell, I'd rather have people think that at least some of it is applicable than none of it, if I stand back and get real objective. But it's always been kind of the burr under my saddle, to use a Western term, that psychology definitely co-opted alchemy. We talk about, like racial appropriation and things like, social justice warriors talk about things like racial appropriation, things like that in these modern times. And realistically, I would talk about the appropriation of alchemy and its massive reductionism by the psychological community. And, I've said this to all my students for a long time. It's not that I disagree with Jung. I think that Carl Jung had some really amazing insights, and it's amazing that he came to the ideas and the philosophies that he did, never having really stepped into a laboratory or if he did step into a laboratory, it certainly wasn't under a proper alchemical context. And so, you know, realistically, if he would have gotten in, he would have been able to talk about destillatio, you know, the processes of distillation and what those archetypes mean. He would have been able to talk about those in a really practical way, saying, you know, there's something interesting. When you take a ferment, just like wine, and you pour that into a flask, and you're seeing this colored material, okay, you have red wine inside of a flask, you're seeing this colored material, and you apply heat, and now all of a sudden these big beautiful streaks start to come over, and you know, it looks like the wine legs on a nice bottle of wine when you swirl it around the glass, these long streaks that are just beautiful. Those start to distill over in your alembic, and you start to see that, and it's a phenomena of nature. You know, it's really based on specific gravity and heat density and stuff from a physical perspective. But if you don't know about any of that stuff, looking at it from the perspective of all people before about the 1800s, right? We look at sticking wine in a flask and applying heat, and then the only thing that comes over really is the ethanol until the ethanol is completely distilled out. So if it's a 15% wine, then you get 15% by volume of that distillate that is alcohol. And all of the water and all of the color of that wine stays behind in the boiling flask. And you say, ooh, this is interesting. This is a refinement of something within us, within our particular spirit. And then you can start to draw the correlations and say, what is it? How does my body psychologically and spiritually reflect what I just saw, knowing that what I distilled out was the spirit of the material? So what does this look like inside of me? And what you can really say is all of your talents and all of your interests and all of those things, they need to be concentrated with their practice in order for you to get better at them, to really perfect them. And so he would have been able to say, like, oh, spirit is discipline. And the more that you concentrate on something, the more you're able to build that discipline and isolate it so that that becomes the thing that you are really, you know, intent on, that you're really, really adept at, because you've built so much discipline around it. And you'd be able to see without any shadow of a doubt that that's what's going on. And everything that's left behind, you know, the water, you can distill, you can change out your receiver and distill out that water, and that becomes phlegm. That also becomes clear water, and it has a little bit of scent from the source that it came from after you distill it out a time or two. But for the most part, it's like a clean distilled water again. And you'd be able to know, okay, so like the majority of the animating fluids inside of my body, that's not the essence of it. That's just the material that is circulating through in order to carry the essence, because we distill out the essence with the spirit. For instance, if I get you to drink a shot of poitín, which is basically whiskey that's not been aged in an oak barrel, or if I get you to drink vodka, or if I get you to drink a silver tequila, anything that hasn't already been aged in oak, and you taste them all, they all taste different. So that part of the essence of that plant has transferred over with the spirit of that material. And you would be able to draw the correlations to the transpersonal aspects of yourself that these things correspond to. And so this is where I get kind of blown away that Jung actually got to as far as he did with his postulations and theories and approach without ever really having stepped into the laboratory, because he wasn't that far off. But there are so many things that psychologically are talked about that don't really have any substantial basis when you get into the laboratory and you really start working with it. So, you know, people have a tremendous background in Jung and they think, oh yeah, I'm very familiar with alchemy. They get into the laboratory and pretty much all of that goes right out.
Well, you can look at the names of the base material and derive a lot. If you go in, you don't know a thing about Jung, and or anyone that's talking about this stuff from a psychological standpoint, and you go in and you look at just the titles, like we were talking about earlier, sulfur is the soul, right?
Yes.
And on down, Mercury is the spirit, salt is the body. I mean, this stuff is applicable in a lot of stuff. Salt, Lot's wife turns around and turns into salt, the salt of the earth. I mean, we have all these correspondences.
Yes.
That the ash, I mean, how important is that? And so these if you're an intelligent person and you're coming from even an inkling of some sort of philosophical leaning and pushing towards the idea of language and distilling the language and trying to extrapolate what you need from it, then the word and the languaging of alchemy is very rich.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think that's probably why it got, so to say, co-opted by the psychological realm, is because there's so much there. Like you say, it's so rich. You can draw from it and you can extrapolate inspiration in any myriad number of ways. And yeah, I realistically, that's kind of my goal. Whether people do decide to just be, psychological application, I still want to teach them about the laboratory practices and about the more deep psychological applications of it beyond just Jungian psychology, in order to be able to add a little bit of depth and a little bit of more accuracy to the correlations that they're drawing, or the approach that they have in purifying the psyche, or going on the hero's journey, or any of these other things that we hear about where alchemy is brought up and continually used in a kind of a misappropriated way. Not as bad as people who say, "Oh, I do alchemical basket weaving," or whatever.
Oh my God.
But still,
it's like Instagram pretty.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's like it's a widely misunderstood term. Like oftentimes I'll tell people, like they'll say, "Well, what do you do?" And I'm like, "Well, technically I'm an alchemist, but I focus in on Spagyric." And they're like, "Alchemy is way cool. I make some morning elixirs and blah blah blah."
Oh Lord.
It's like, well, that's great. That's a good start. But it's not really in the same vein even.
No, it's not. But this is one of the things, like for me, with in particular Jung, I don't read modern Jungians, and I've really always stuck with Jung's work, and then the people right around him that were getting all sloppy with him because nothing was clinical, and they were working on each other. And so, but that led me into, so alchemy had always been, let me put it this way, alchemy had always been out there for me as something I love, and I was seeing it in the magical world, and that's the world I was brought up in. And so I would see it in the Rosicrucian works and all
that's the main corpus. I mean, you hear it in Freemasonry and other things, but you really get it concentrated in Rosicrucian.
Yeah, absolutely. And so those images have always spoken to me. And then when I encountered it in like Psychology and Alchemy, one of Jung's books, and then just later on, I started to have this desire to understand the physicality of getting in a real lab. And at that time, you know this, there was so little available. There were so few people to go to. And then when the internet comes on, it's just amazing how hard it was to get a real discussion on alchemy going.
Yeah, it's always been, just small little circles of interest, and you're real lucky if you came across those circles because they didn't advertise too heavily.
No, not at all.
So it's always pretty much been like that. I mean, even when alchemy was kind of at its heyday, the actual people who knew things were actually dwarfed by the number of people who didn't know things who claimed to be an alchemist. And so, the thread of authenticity there has always been a very small pool to draw from.
And like you said, it still is. I mean, that's why I'm thrilled that you're so close to me. I'm so like.
Well, and you know about Robert Bartlett too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Robert Bartlett's up in your neck of the woods. He's up in Marysville on the Tulalip Indian reservation out there, a Native American reservation, and absolutely fantastic teacher. He's got so much experience. He's been practicing since before I was even born, actually. So when people really enjoyed the path that I'm on, I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Robert Bartlett, who, even though I've learned some things from Robert, he wasn't my primary teacher. I'm self-taught, but his works have lended greatly. Like even before he had published books, he had published a paper with the Paracelsus Research Society called The Thermal Decomposition of the Metal Acetates, where he was talking about how to be able to perform the separation of metal acetates like gold acetate or, cupric acetate or any of these other types of acetate minerals, and perform a dry distillation of them to be able to yield an acetone as the spirit of that metal and the oil of that metal, like the oil of gold, for instance, and then also the body of that material for various pathways for continuing with the creation of the philosopher's stone or other more advanced medicines. And so, he's just been a powerhouse ever since like 1984, 1985, somewhere in there when he started. And maybe it could have been even a little earlier than that, but that's when Frater Albertus died. That's really when Robert Bartlett, as we know of him today, that's really kind of when he started. Everything else was just training. So
Frater Albertus, I'm sure there are tons of people don't know who he is, but so I feel like perhaps maybe you should give him a little airtime.
Yeah, sure. Man, I'd like to sing that guy's praises as often as possible. Frater Albertus ran, his name is Dr. Albert Riedel, but he went by Frater Albertus, Frater being the Latin term for brother, that pretty much everybody in the Rosicrucian society, if it's a female that you're talking to, you call her soror, or sister, and if it's a male, you call him frater, which means brother. So at any rate, he decided to go by the name Frater Albertus for all of his alchemical work, and he had learned, I think, under Alberto Pincaldi when he was in Switzerland, and that was his whole lineage that had been passed on to him. And eventually he moved to the United States and was involved at Rosicrucian Park, San Jose, teaching alchemy classes by Orson Greaves, or maybe it's Orson Graves. I can't remember if it's Greaves or Grave. But anyway, they were teaching practical alchemy classes in the Rosicrucian order at that time. This would have been roughly between the 40s to the 60s, if I remember right. And then Orson started to fall off. They started trying to get a few other teachers, and eventually, it just wasn't the same after he died, and they couldn't keep it afloat for one reason or the other. And so they didn't have any more alchemy classes of their own. And Frater Albertus had moved to Utah and found this wonderful place off of 13th East, or maybe it's 700 East and 3300 South in Salt Lake, and decided that he was going to open up an entire location for 12 students at a time to come in, bunk, stay on site for 14 days, 2 weeks, and to study day in and day out, basically Monday through Friday, 8 hours a day, plus the time that it took to oversee the lab work. So oftentimes distillations are going through the night, or a sublimation is going, and you have to wake up, and you have to check on it. And so he hosted that, and that was known as the Paracelsus Research Society, that was here in Salt Lake City, Utah. And he died before I was born, 2 years before I was born. So I didn't get the opportunity to meet him, but I ended up meeting a lot of his students. I met them first at the International Alchemy Conference, which was held in Las Vegas in 2007, and again in 2008. And I think they were guests of honor. They tried to get all of the living students of Frater Albertus together, I think in 2009 in Long Beach, California, when they had it then. But I got to meet a lot of these people. I got to meet Frater Albertus's daughter and other folks like that. And so I've been able to inherit actually a lot of materials from those students, written materials, little tips and tricks, a lot of labware that, especially because most of the materials that I have today from Paracelsus Research Society came to me through one of their secretaries and office managers. Her name was Viola Engel. And her huusband Norm were students of Frater Albertus, and they were also students of Jean Dubuis and the Philosophers of Nature, and had studied with Jack Glass and Russ House in the early 90s. So they had this long tradition of 30 years almost of being in alchemy and all of these materials, and those ended up making their way to me. So largely my tradition, even though I'm self-taught, if it wasn't for those materials, I never would have been where I'm at today. And so that's for sure a huge part of my tradition is the Albertus / Dubuis tradition, which are very, very so close, in fact, that you could hardly say that there's any differentiation, maybe just slightly in approach or character, but not really in terms of what you draw away from the work. So yeah, Frater Albertus, major, probably the biggest name, possibly besides Jean Dubuis, in the alchemical community throughout the entire 20th century. And yeah, hats off to him and hats off to Jean Dubuis, because all of us in the United States especially are standing on their shoulders for our alchemical tradition that is very well alive and still practiced today.
It's having a renaissance, it appears.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the cycles of the universe are actually relatively similar. There's more harmonizing aspect that's happening right now, but the cycles of awakening and you know, realistically, the Renaissance was born out of a form of dark ages of people living according to a convention and having lost ancient wisdom. And if you
Yes.
take a look at that definition of it and look at where we're at today, living in a particular tradition, having lost our ancient wisdom and needing to rebirth that in some way, have it come to the forefront. We've already seen things like this with you know, festival culture over the last, you know, 20 years or whatever is really growing very popular. That kind of thing is how Renaissances start in general, is rebirth of ideas, coming back to tribalism, but in new ways, expressing art, music, and culture, and mathematics, and ideas, and so on and so forth. That's what really, those are the baking ingredients, so to speak, to bake the bread of a Renaissance culture. And we're deep in the oven already. all the ingredients have been mixed, and we're baking. So,
which makes it all the more interesting that current events have pretty much killed festival culture completely.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, one of the things that you can see is that any establishment that's trying to maintain the tradition that they know, and realistically, in the modern age, this isn't much different than it was back then. It's financing industry, because what is financed largely is what is pushed upon the people. And it doesn't matter whether you go back to ancient Mesopotamia or whether you look at it right now. It's just like, those are the things wherever the money is, that's kind of the life source of the astral plane for most individuals now. You don't think that you have security unless you have money. It's just that simple. You don't think that you can save for the future if you can't eat tonight. And so money becomes the symbol for all of those things. And just whatever people want to finance, wherever they put their money, that's the thoughts that are going to be funded that eventually precipitate into the physical experience that we have. And this is why when people say, you know, you vote with every dollar that you spend, it's absolutely true. And the same thing is true about your own personal health and well-being and so on and so forth. If you spend a lot of your time and a lot of your money on getting healthy, on breaking away from the system, on earning your independence, those are the fruits that are going to show up, because that's what you planted earlier in the year, so to speak. And if you know, are focusing on different things that are not aligned with that goal, or just going with the status quo, then you become a tool to push forward the goals of the financiers, as opposed to driving the money and getting the financiers to invest in the things that you really want. Because again, the financiers, they are just trying to put their money where it's going to produce the best return. Anybody can be a financier. Anybody can ultimately be rich overnight, realistically, depending on the way people think and what they value. And you know, what I like about alchemy is that alchemy shows us principles. And I like to, you know, I took a class, it was a financial class many years ago by a brilliant, he was in the insurance industry and financial securities, all sorts of things. I don't even know how to describe him, but his name is Marvin Reynolds. And he's got a book out, I forget the name of it, but Marv always used to say that there are really three things. There are values, and values are individual and they're personal. So what do you place value on? And then there are principles, and principles are things that don't give a shit about you or your personal values. They're true regardless. They're like a perennial thing that constantly show us the way that things objectively work. And when you value principles for long enough and live in that state, then you develop virtue. And virtue is when values have been perfectly aligned to the principles, such to the degree that a virtue is now determined. So it's basically the same thing as in alchemy, where we'll take like a fixed sulfur or a volatile sulfur, like an essential oil in the vegetable kingdom, and distill it with an ethanol and perform all these cohobations over and over and over and over and over again in order to intrinsically marry them together that end material is virtuous in the same way that when your values practically match up with perennial principles of the universe and of objectivity, now you've developed some sort of virtue in this life. And ideally, I think that if people of the modern day can begin to grasp that, really tangibly grasp that, and start valuing the things that and the ideas and the art and the, whatever it is, and putting their money where their mouth is, quite literally, to turn a phrase, things can change very, very rapidly. I just heard recently that there was a group of African Americans who decided to get together, and they purchased 19 acres way out of the city because they were sick of all of the inner city politics of this and that, and black versus white, and BLM, and all. They were like, nah, to hell with all of that, man.
Yeah.
We're just going to go do our own thing. And they got like 10 families together, 19 acres, and they've started their city and stuff. And everybody's always trying to say, oh, black people are underpaid and they can't do that. Well, then how did they do that? Or, white people are oppressive and they own all the land. Well, somehow they were able to find a way to be able to purchase it. So, people just really need to get behind what they can do and what they want to do, as opposed to focusing so heavily on what they can't do or the problems that currently exist within the system. It's like Buckminster Fuller always said, you cannot defeat a system by trying to go against it because the resistance is just way too big. You have to create a new system that makes the old system obsolete. And by doing that, people will come around. So I think that applying and weaving alchemy into our social fabric, regardless of the application, because I don't expect everybody to step into the lab and always practice lab work or get interested in Spagyria or whatever else. But I do expect them, just like you would have a general education, to know about alchemy and its processes so that you can derive it away and apply it in your life, because there's not one aspect of life, not one thought, not one thing, not one anything that you can think or conceive of or see that doesn't abide by alchemical processes already, because that's just its nature. That's what it does.
Yeah, and this is where some of the great philosophical minds, why they were gravitating to the processes, even if they weren't in the lab. This is why they were gravitating to these processes and pushing that idea further before it became thinned out. I
think we should talk Canadian to say processes from now on.
Processes.
Good suggestion.
Vitamins. Let's see. Oh my goodness, I totally got derailed on my thought. So with all this, the idea of, and it's kind of, this all ties in together, but the idea of, and through the process of alchemy, and I'm talking about in the lab when you're working with the prime materials here, and how you get to something more substantive, something purified. One of the ways, and this is the side note to where I'm going, one of the things I feel like has brought the idea of the chemistry, the lab work into the populace is this new wave of understanding marijuana. Terpenes now has become a common word, right? People understand what that means.
Oh man, that is funny that you mentioned that, because 5 to 7 years ago, when I was trying to train people who they'd pay me, they'd be like, oh, I know the Spagyria has something to do with the next level of cannabis, can you teach me? And I'm like, yeah, let's pull the essential oil of cannabis. And their eyes were just like, what the hell do you even mean? And now today, everybody's using the chemical terms. It's like, oh yeah, there's tons of triterpenes and terpenes, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, oh, okay, so cool. It's all of a sudden like it came on overnight. People got really hip on terpenes after like a couple of conventions where people were talking about it. So yeah, it's very interesting. But what were you going to say about that? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to derail you again.
No, I wanted to definitely bring light to that. It's something I've noticed, and I think because of that awareness through cannabis, it's doing a favor to the actual work of all this goodness. I wanted to look at the idea of immortality.
Okay.
And that's very much tied into some of the greater work that's talked about in some of the old tomes. And
Yeah.
so where I'm going with that is open-ended. What are your thoughts on that idea? And how does that play out with some of the elixirs that have come through over our historical documents, and where this idea of life extension now finds its way into the laboratory?
Yeah, so, immortality is discussed in most of the world's alchemical texts, whether you're talking about India or China or the West. And every different alchemist had their own way about going about it. Especially that was like one of the peak things of why, as a practical alchemist, there would be a practical need beyond just demonstration for the philosopher's stone, is that immortality is granted to those who give their lives tremendous amount of things to research and to do. And there's so many avenues and so many secrets that nature has yet to offer, that within the course of a single human life, you can really only scratch upon the surface, regardless of how we look at it and like, whoa, this person did all these things. Okay, that's still just barely scratching the surface, maybe even just blowing away the dust off the box, not even opening it up. So being able to, if you have a very large drive and determination to be able to look at these things, write these things, know these things, work for the benefit of humanity and so on and so forth, then longevity or immortality, regardless of how you want to describe that or define it, becomes a very practical thing. It's not just something like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to live so long, like most people do, and they even say it with like that very same cadence. And it's not cool if you haven't processed your shit, if you don't know how to process grief, if you don't know how to process trauma, if you don't know how to compartmentalize properly, if you don't have path working things already sorted out with practical ways of working with the tree of life, if you don't have herbs behind you and really good clean foods and all these other things, no, you're just creating perpetual suffering, actually. And so immortality, and they talk about this in a lot of texts, or the way in the European text that they would say is like, if by the grace of God you manage to achieve your work, then like God has basically said, you're a-okay, you're good to go, you've earned the badge to be able to get some life extension. But even at that, immortality, we don't know that people have actually ever been truly completely immortal, but the amount of longevity that you get, 2, 3, sometimes 4 or 500 years, according to some of the legends, and I literally call them that at this point, as legends, because there's been nobody in recent years that has really even come close to that. All of the greatest alchemists of our age typically die in their 70s or 80s. And I know there's people out there like, yeah, but did they really? I know that people saw Frater Albertus in Switzerland after he died.
Right, there was that myth.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, well, okay, maybe, but still, I don't think that that's probably the case, because, like Frater Albertus, for instance, he got very sick after he got defamed. He was sleeping with half of his office staff, his female office staff, as a married Mormon, and so, yeah, that was quite the debacle. And, Viola explained it to me, and she had the most utmost love and respect for Frater, but she said if that man had one character flaw, it was that he climbed too highly on a pedestal that he built for himself, and the fall is what killed him.
Mm-hmm. Oh, often. I mean, that's a parable.
Yeah. So I think that that's one of those things to remember, is that Frater was psychically gifted as you could possibly be from all of the accounts, even from his daughter's accounts and so on and so forth. He was very adept in the laboratory. He had this charming way of going about life and things, but he still suffered, and he still had a lot of human shit that was not yet processed. And not to say that you have to be at a completely clear place in order to achieve immortality, but you would think that you'd be a little bit further beyond that. Otherwise, you would be creating very perpetual suffering. What's it going to look like for your wife that you've loved, even if you did cheat on her with multiple people? What if when she dies, how are you going to handle that? What about your children when they die? What about, all these other things? There's just a whole lot there that people really need to think about You know, you think about the loss of losing a dog or a pet or something like that, and you have to put things like that into context. Plus, you can't stay in one place for very long because you don't age very quickly. And so people say, like, they see you and they're like, "Oh yeah, you're in your late 60s, early 70s for the last 10 years, Bob. What's going on?"
Got to
And
keep moving.
yeah, you do. And so it would become problematic actually in a lot of cases. But longevity, um, in general, even in the Taoist text, is really created for those beings that give themselves tremendous amount of purpose and are constantly serving humanity or holding space for humanity to be able to, you know, achieve a next evolution, an upgrade, and so on and so forth. And I know that there's also some, you know, conspiracies, so to speak, about most of the financiers and the, you know, the 13 financing families. They know about alchemy and they've practiced alchemy and they're performing sociological alchemy. And I would just say bullshit. If they were, we'd be in a much better place. They would have a whole lot more sensibility and a whole lot more alchemical material pushed into the mainstream, and not just, you know, I'm not just talking about Babylonian magic, you know, serving Moloch or whatever, which seems to be what they're really into. It's like baser theurgy instead of alchemical work. True alchemical work indicates that a person is really doing the internal transformations as well as the external transformations, and there's a space between those two that is also getting transformed, which we would call spirit. And I think that, yeah, I've never seen, like John H. Reed, for instance, okay, a good friend of mine, a mentor of mine in certain cases, a colleague of mine in other cases. Okay, John H. Reed the third lives in upstate New York. He wrote, you know, the complete, I forget what it is, complete alchemy guidebook or something like that years ago. It's in PDF form, it's no longer in print. So if you can actually find a physical copy, that's awesome. But they're typically really expensive when you do find them. That being said, you know, when he got into this work, he was heavy into Satanism and just wanted power and money and girls and, you know, whatever else. And, you know, the work in and of itself changed him real fast. That's just the way that it always works, is that you think you're working on the materials and you have some sort of material drive, but if you're awake and aware at all, the materials are actually working on you. And if you're not, you know, if you're not actually getting that out of it, then you're not practicing alchemy. Maybe you're practicing mundane chemistry or something. But I still don't think that they would be using that for a financial model. It's much easier to create numbers out of thin air than it is to get in the laboratory.
That's always something I've taken away from some of the older tomes on the work, is that, and I think that's where people like Jung came in and extrapolated this, is that the work was showing up in their world. They were changing, and if the vessel cracked and, you know, and everything came out that was reflecting in their life, if it was sealed and they were able to move to the next stage, this was also reflecting in their life, that whole as above so below aspect.
Right.
So, and that is also just the idea of that, of doing the physical work in the laboratory and then gaining something deeper from it. Whether that's in your outer world, in your dream world, in your, you know, the religion of what's going on within you, those kinds of things. The work always shows, and we see this just in our lives too. I mean, it's so apparent. This is why I've always liked the old Chinese practitioners, you know, the stories. I'll probably get criticized on this again, but there's just so many stories of the masters. You know, by the time someone comes up to get diagnosed, I mean, traditionally they'd be at the end of a long haul and they'd have them diagnosed by the time they got to the table. And there are tons of these stories, and in Chinese.
Yeah.
And so, because they watched how they walked, they watched their character and their skin and their nails and stuff. And then the master would say this, and that.
Yeah.
And so these stories are out there, whether they're nonsense or not. There's something to the story and to extrapolate from the idea of the story. And so there's a process here. There's always a process. I like the idea of Frodder's messiness in his own life, because that's one of the things you see in anyone that's pushing forward with stuff. That's why I like Jung and Freud and those people. They were all fucking each other. They were all from, you know what I'm saying? Jung had mistresses. He was working on his patients. He was working these ideas and theories out. It was happening. And so, you know, the fact, and now it's so clinical, and, you know, there's moralistic stuff going on. But people that are down and dirty in the lab are getting down and dirty. And with that, I was wondering, when you're in the process of something new, when you're pushing forward in your work, and you know you're onto something bigger and new. And I gather this from your site too. I mean, this is the whole process of why you do this, right? You're moving into these new, people to understand there's a planetary aspect, there's timing involved with all this.
There is. So
everything is very specific and rare in that sense.
Definitely. And it takes so much split testing to be able to actually determine whether the old dudes were writing about it at face value and telling the truth, or whether there were little double blinds in there. And if it was a double blind, does it mean this or this or this? And you just have to develop a ton of mental buoyancy, really, to begin to think outside of the box and to also think logically. So you have to start small and know the things that they talked about that were really easy, like distilling wine and so on and so forth, and get the imagery down and understand it all, in order to make sense of the later works where, you know, it's actually quite complicated imagery, and oftentimes there are double blinds that are thrown in so that you don't know the actual solvent or the actual salt that they're putting in there. And you kind of have to put things together. And so that investigative work is really, it's for my personality, it's just right up my alley. It's what I love to do. I've always loved investigating things, and that's where all the split tests really come in for me. So every time that I perform something, I do 3 or 4 things that I know are going to be wrong in the hopes that one of them might be right. And that's the nature of split testing, and finding out, you know, how to actually work and what they actually said, and demystifying those old texts and bringing them to the light of modern day, and giving them a proper context in the modern day too. So
a noble cause.
Yeah, fun at any rate.
Definitely. and educational. I was curious if there are any astrological correlations that you adhere to during your work.
Well, hell,
or does that even help? Is it a thing?
Well, it's taught within the Rosicrucian corpus of alchemy, the Rosicrucian inspired. So both Jean Dubuis and Albertus and their lineages talk about this, and there are other lineages that do as well, that astrological timing is absolutely everything. And they would say that, you know, so there's sulfur hours, there's a spirit level, and there's a salt level for every single day of the week. And for instance, on Monday, the spirit level is governed over by the moon day, right? So it's Luna governs over the spirit of that whole day. So if you're working on things that are spirits, like fermenting something or distilling something, you might actually want to start it on a Monday in order for it to have that particular spirit on the macrocosmic level. And then the salt hours, they start at midnight, and then there are 7 equal ones throughout the day, one for each of the planets. And so at sunrise, it matches up. So sunrise Monday, approximately like 3:50 to about 6 or 7 or so, is going to be typically your first hour where the moon is in the salt hour right then. So if I were combining a spirit and a salt, Monday sunrise would be the ideal time to do it. And then there's also sulfur hours. So if we're working with extracting something or so on and so forth, and those start from sunrise, and they change every single hour. So you get, 3.5 or so rotations of all of those planets every single day that go through in the sulfur hours. So you have like a couple of hours every day that you could be working on sulfur or initiating sulfur tasks. So that's just on the microcosmic or macrocosmic level. On the microcosmic level, then you also have to take the planetary and constellational determination of the substance that you're working on and cast, charts as far as you can in the future when you know that there's going to be an ideal election in order to be able to work on that particular material. And so it can get really, really complicated. And Tim Wilkerson has a site called alchemyastrology.com. And he published a book a couple of years ago called Alchemy Astrology, Lost Key to the Philosopher's Stone, that was really, really good and showed the methodology that Frater Albertus had taught all of his students to create the grander counts and the lesser counts and find out how many positive influences there are for your work and how many negative influences and stuff. And so, I was balls deep in all of that for a really long time. What ended up happening though is that I started performing IDF analysis and finding out like, hey, is this actually what's happening to the materials that I'm working with, either in sidereal charts or, Vedic astrology versus, modern true to form sidereal or all these other things, and being able to kind of vet ideas and flush them out and get corroborative evidence behind the research that I was doing. And what I found was that actually our calendar and the way that we're keeping time, and even to a larger degree, the way that we're tracking planets, even with the sidereal zodiac that I have, it's still off actually by like up to 5 to 7 degrees in some of the larger constellations like Pisces and Virgo. And so there needs to be new methodologies actually created in order for us to do that. And also I'm realizing that most of the traditional correspondences are not actually true. They're upheld somewhere in the astral as an egregore. And so when you're performing rituals or working with that, you're drawing power from the egregore, drawing power from the thought-based realm. But that only goes so far. If the person's ailments that correspond to ens astrale, actually, the stars and the planets don't derive their power from the astral plane, the way that we would think about it with thoughts and emotions. They derive it from the higher astral, which is actually governed over by the planets and the constellations. And so you need to harness the actual positions of them, not just the thought bases of them. And that's been a very difficult thing actually to come to terms with in my alchemical work, because I'm always striving for the very best, the most potent, and labored under the delusion that I was doing that for years, only come to find out that there's actually more deeper layers that need to be peeled back in order to find the actual workable truth of it here in the modern day. And in fact, I've got a really good episode. It hasn't released yet. Might release this month or next month. He's really busy, but Greg Kaminsky of a Cult of Personality interviewed me, and we went into depth actually about that topic, just the correspondences and other things like that actually being off and not having substantial basis in the actual cosmology that seems to be objective and really controlling and governing our destinies here on Earth. So
it's cool, and it's interesting, the idea of pulling in spirit magic, if you will, whatever, work with egregores into your alchemical physical work. Just makes it even more of a magical process in my head. I don't know why.
Oh yeah, I mean, alchemy isn't magic, but most alchemists have studied magic, and so we incorporate a lot of things. Like we might imbue a particular product with an archangel. We might use the Rose Cross and be able to create a sigil of a name or a quality or a planet or something that we're actually trying to imbue inside of the material and let it digest on a piece of paper like that. We might actually, pray over it, perform ritual, use wands, do candle magic, the pathways are as diverse as the magical pathway of the practitioner. But yeah, the alchemy isn't magic, but oftentimes magical practitioners have an affinity for it. And so those two have been very intimately intertwined since the days of Marsilio Ficino and Paracelsus, and even further back than that a bit.
And I put a link to that podcast in the show notes, so when it does come out, people can find it there.
Awesome, cool, thank you.
Sure, no problem. So I had a question. I'm going to change topics right now. Someone asked about celiac disease and how it seems like people are suddenly getting it more and more. Do you know?
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's absolutely no problem for me to talk about. And it's really no mystery. I think that what they're going to find in just a number of years, and they've already, so many doctors have already found this and talked about it. It's just that it's not, mainstream, so to speak. But celiac really comes from, it's an autoimmune condition that happens where your body starts to eat away at various parts of itself because it's used to breaking down the proteins inside of wheat, and your microbiome has actually been compromised due to a poisonous form of wheat. So you eat the type of wheat that has the poison on it, and the first time it just weakens your microbiome. The next time that you eat it, your CD8 plus T cells and other lymphocytes end up detecting that it actually is a poisonous material, and they start to eat away at it. And then what ends up happening is that your body's natural enzyme capacity, because of the microbiomes and also because of the autoimmune conditions and the waste that are produced inside of the body, they just kind of go completely to the wayside. And so it's no coincidence that we have seen completely depleted agriculture eating either nutrient void materials that are basically just fillers, or also eating nutrient void materials that have been sprayed with pesticides that alter hormones and endocrinology, of course, and also reduce the microbiome. And what they're trying to blame it on is genetics. They're trying to say, oh, this is genetics. And realistically, all of your genes are absolutely perfectly stable. The genes just tell your body what natural deficiencies or what natural disorders are going to end up showing up as a result of toxicities, poisons, or other causes of disease. So they're really just the guider of how that autoimmune system reacts. Like, for instance, some people will have celiac disease, other people are going to develop Hashimoto's, other people are going to develop just say, different allergies and things like that. And it's all just autoimmune response. But it starts with healing. It really starts with having a really good analysis to be able to see what the cause of that autoimmune trigger was. Because just because you ate pesticide food, that doesn't necessarily mean that that was the actual trigger. It could have had its cause of disease in the astral. It could have also had it due to natural reasons, like, for instance, the pancreas was not working very well and wasn't tonified, and so you developed a carbohydrate metabolism disorder. It could be because of leaky gut, which most oftentimes it is, like 90% plus of the time, and so on and so forth. And so you have to be able to find these things and be able to know what the root cause of it is in order to be able to treat it on the level of its own causation. Not to say that I ever treat anything, because I don't and I can't, but what I do is I research things, and oftentimes my clients, more often than not actually, will always say like, oh, wow, yeah, you did this thing, you sent these broadcasts or frequencies, or I took this Spagyric for a little while, and now I don't have these symptoms. And it's like, oh, okay, noted. Thank you. And eventually we'll present enough of those case studies that, we're moving towards a peer review, of course, with it all, so that other people can do the very same thing, and we can peer review and find things out, and just work with a whole new system of energetic medicine really is the end goal. But, that just starts with the humble research of split testing and working with clients now. And so, yeah, celiac though is typically not a problem. You just have to find the level of causation and, get work on it. It's all the more mysterious conditions that people have where, like, it's like one-off kind of things. You don't have a very large portion of the population that has things like this, like Good Shepherd's disease happens in the kidneys, and I think it also attacks the lungs sometimes. But like things like that, they don't happen that frequently, and so it's really hard for us as a researcher to be able to even know what to research or what to investigate in order to try and eliminate it most of the time. So, but yeah, celiac disease, Hashimoto's, all of the common autoimmune conditions, they pretty much all have a similar source. And most of them come down to a compromised or damaged microbiome, at least on the physiological level. And there may be other things accompanying that led to that trigger. But yeah, there's not one particular cure. It's not a one size fits all either within the basis of my research. And so unfortunately, I can't say, oh yeah, if you have it, here's all you need to do. It's like, and every case is actually very individual, and you need to treat it as if it were individual.
Cool. Is there someone else asked this too, if you had a specific diet that you recommend people follow?
Oh man, if I wanted to get a kick, this would really be the time to just tell people to do something and just sit back and watch to see what happens. Um, I'll tell you what though, in terms of diet, man, I've personally been all over the place. I was raw vegan for a while. I was vegan for a while. I was Bhakti diet for a while, which is a form where you cut out all foods of ignorance and passion, is what they're called. Um, and so I didn't eat any onions. I didn't even eat any root vegetables at one time because you had to kill the
Oh,
organism. It was just
those are my
fruits,
favorite.
flowers, seeds, nuts. And I went completely off the wall with all of this stuff, just trying to see what was perfect for my own body. I stopped eating beans because of Pythagorean suggestions, like
Yeah, yeah.
so many different types of things. And eventually, once I started learning about biodynamic gardening and got into the Weston Price Foundation and other things like that, and biodynamic farming, I started
Yeah.
incorporating a lot more meats into my diet and animal proteins and all these other things, to the point today where I will eat just about anything, but it has to be sourced really well. And then I also take into account traditional Chinese medicine
Yes.
guidelines as best as possible. I'm still learning TCM, so I'm not like a very good, reliable resource for dietary advice for this. But I personally,
none of this is medical advice. We're not medical practitioners. We're just chatting. So.
yeah, exactly. We're totally just chatting. But for me, it comes down to understanding my constitution, understanding the season of the year, and understanding any sort of imbalances that I might have at present, and being able to only eat foods that are going to help to nourish my body and to be able to mitigate those imbalances and keep everything balanced. So if you have too much damp heat,
Yeah.
or cold spleen tea, for instance, you wouldn't want to drink ice cold drinks, and you wouldn't want to eat like ice cream, and definitely not like eat some spicy pizza and then some ice cream. Like, it's things like that. And all sorts of different foods have different kinds of qualities inside of TCM. And so for me, it's learning about those qualities, learning about how I'm combining the foods, or eating them separately in order to just get that one particular type of thing, and then trying to balance out my particular body. Because based on my experience and also IDF data, there's no one diet that is good for any individual for any length of time. You constantly have to be in a state of dynamic movement with your diet, and that deals largely with what's local and what's seasonal and what's available, but it also deals with your own personal constitution and things that that could be out of balance. And if you eat for your constitution, that's going to be the very best diet that I think is possible, as opposed to dietary fads or veganism, Pythagoreanism, or any of these other things. So that would be my answer.
I started with the biodynamic gardening a long time ago in New Mexico. It was my segue into permaculture.
Yeah,
and
mine too.
Oh yeah, it often is. And Maria Thunsberg book, or however you pronounce her.
Yeah, I got listeners tore me apart after Crow 777 one time. They're like, it's pronounced Toon. She's German, Maria Toon. And I was
Okay,
like, oh,
yeah,
okay.
I know.
I was going to say that, but I held my tongue.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't matter. I put her principles to work, so I don't. It's like I may be pronouncing it wrong, but the book changed my life because I actually walked her talk. So, whereas that's all right. Anyway, and also like you, I have tried a million different ways of different nutritional ways of finding what was right for my constitution, and then it's ever changing. And I always find when I get to this really great balance and stride, I'm able to pretty much have what I want, of course, with those basic tenets of well-sourced and seasonal and all those laurels that I think people should really look into and try and ride those kinds of waves, because our temples, our vessels more so, are so they're specific. They're very specific. And it's, in a way, it's that whole snowflake thing, devoid of political conversation with your vessel. It's a very specific thing.
Yeah.
And working with a lot of variables. And so it behooves one to experiment with yourself. And it's amazing to me how many people do not, and how much resistance there is in the world to it. And so,
yeah, I mean, realistically, your body and your soul are like indelibly intertwined in this lifetime. You can't really, if you don't have good health, then the quality of your thoughts and the quality of you acting out your volition is going to be so limited. You only get one body in this particular manifestation. So like that's the only thing that you're actually guaranteed and given in this life. And so to put it at the forefront of the human experience, I've got to learn how to be able to sustain this in as healthy a way as possible. You would think that that would be the number one focus of everybody. And then once you get some sort of handle on that, then it's like everything else falls in line for you. But yeah, that one that's absolutely critical, because if you aren't taking care of your own health and wellness, nobody else is going to be interested in doing it for you, to be perfectly honest. Like doctors, you can see how overtaxed they are. You can see how, they've just become null and completely numb to the experience of being able to help people, because people aren't putting in any effort to be able to help themselves.
Well, that's the basis of all this, right? You've got to do the work.
You have to do the work. Yeah. There's no way out of it. You can avoid it and avoid it and avoid it, but then you just get repercussions down the line, and you have nobody to blame but yourself in most cases. Now, the only exception I'd say to that is that historically speaking, people have not really taken into account the astral cause of disease, or if they have, they've done it in such a way like the way that the Renaissance authors and modern day Judith Hill talks about medical astrology. And I found that to be, I've studied that for years and worked with that system for a very long time. And I found it to be almost completely useless in the face of what actually causes astral diseases. Mm-hmm. And all of my research has completely turned everything that I've learned about on my head. So, but that's one of those things, regardless either way. It's like you're just born under a sign, and then the way that the position of the planets move after that determines whether you're going to get sick or not. And so in some ways you can't really help those things. If your parents are responsible, they get talismans made on the day of your birth. But how many metallurgists do you have available to just make some talismans for you for your baby on the day of their birth? I mean, it's crazy. So yeah, IDF data is like the only thing that I've really found to be able to clear that out very well and reliably in the modern day. And God, I'll tell you, I some of the people's issues, like over 90% of the people that I see have ancestrally issues. And I'm not sure if that's because I'm attracting the types of individuals that have the types of disease where they can't figure it out through any other thing. And so they don't mind throwing some research dollars to see if we can come up with any leads. Or whether that's true across the board. There's still plenty of variables for me to say, but I can say very definitively, like over 90% of people that come to see me have ancestrally issues as usually their number one cause of, when we check the 5 entia, their number one causation of what's causing their symptoms. So that's been really fascinating for me and gives me a good perspective. It's like, man, people could do all the right things and live all the right way, take all the right herbs, take all the right, and live completely in balance, and still you might get hit with disease. But that's when it comes down to the sociological integration of, and which will happen hopefully in the next 20 years, of the types of information that I'm able to pull. And I'm sure there's other researchers out there pulling equally as magnificent information that we just don't have access to anymore. And incorporating it into our society. So yeah, hopefully we all get awesomer and healthier and better over the next 15 to 20 years. I think it just depends on where people place their money. If they value the medical system and keep using insurance from their work and other things to try and participate in that system, even though they don't trust it and don't like it, then it's just going to continue to perpetuate. If you put your money elsewhere, to your local traditional Chinese medicine practitioners or Ayurvedic practitioners, medicine, or research folks like myself, then maybe you can see a whole new future here in the next, a very, very short period of time, really. So
that's what I do. I've been doing it a very, very long time. Would you break down on your website, when people go there on the shop section with what you have, you've got tags on stuff. So very rare, the reviewed stuff, the must-haves. Break that down for people that may be wanting to check out what you have. The must-haves are, when I was looking today, all very appealing. Obviously, you're putting must-have on it.
Yeah. There's a lot of really things that I suggest that everybody must have inside of their apothecary.
It's not a lot. There you just have a few in there.
Yeah, I think moringa would probably be one of those, though. I'm not sure if that's one that you're looking at or not, but like moringa, mumio,
Mhm.
God, yeah, there's a couple of them that come to mind that are just absolutely critical to have on hand because there's nothing else like it that you're going to be able to get or to make when you find yourself in a pinch. And
Yeah.
these are just things that are absolutely critical. So, yeah, I put some suggestions like that on there. Yeah, like other ones that are very rare. That means that either the herb is very, very difficult to get a hold of. Like for instance,
The ginseng, I had
yeah,
my eye on.
American ginseng. I worked with a fellow who imports very large quantities of raw herbs from the Orient all over. India, China, Taiwan, Tibet, Thailand. Indonesia, all over, and he found this 20 to 40-year-old American ginseng that we were able to work on, and he commissioned me to make the most advanced form of medicine that I could possibly make. And so there was Madfred Junius's Spagyrics. Had remembered reading years prior a formula for a chlysis of angelica root, and so I was like, well, I'll just work on this the same way, even though it's not angelica, it's American ginseng root, but I did. And that's probably the most potent thing that I've got in my apothecary. And the chances of anybody listening to this ever encountering a 20 to 40-year-old ginseng plant is
Yeah.
like 1 in a million.
It's like gold.
Yeah, you probably, if you have seen it or have access to it, then you probably have land on the eastern seaboard where you are like not letting people harvest ginseng and you're not harvesting yourself and you've owned the property for 20 or 30 years or more already. And so
Yeah.
just like the chances of actually having that are astronomical. So yeah, that, and then also to make a chlysis is not just a skip and a hop either. I mean, that's one of the most involved forms of spagyric pharmacopoeia that you can possibly make. And so that one is just, that's
I have
outrageous.
it in my cart, right? It's before we went into the show.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
Hopefully it's still there when the show ends.
yeah, exactly. I bet you it will be because it is a pretty large price tag because it's so rare and because the chlysis is so difficult to make. I also have an elixir of it. I think the elixir is a little bit cheaper, and it's equally as good. It's just that elixirs and chlysi do two entirely different things. An elixir can be produced in pretty large quantities, actually, depending on the amount of salt that you add to the material. So I had more elixir to draw from than I had the chlysis. But in addition to that, the elixir works very much so on the physical constituents, and it contains a lot of glycosides and other materials, whereas the chlysis contains a lot of the essential oil and volatiles mixed with all of the other forms of distilled medicine. So it's, yeah, the chlysis is definitely a very strong, very potent form of medicine. I've only got chlysi of a few materials, but moringa chlysis would be another one. And that one was made instead of with just roots, I was made with leaf, roots, seed pod.
Yeah, the whole thing's edible.
Yeah,
So
flowers,
yeah.
bark. We
Yeah.
threw all of the parts in there, and that was a collaboration with Moringa for Life is the name of their business. And yeah,
I
so
love moringa. It's so easy. It grows here like weeds. I have it in my garden.
really.
Yes. And I've heard people out here where I live say they have trouble with it, but I can throw the seeds in the ground and they sprout.
You might be close enough to the banana belt there that I think that you're probably right. I think you could, nice and temperate, pretty much all year long in a certain regard. You don't get too much snow and stuff. Usually people that have snow, the roots will freeze over and then they die, then just don't come back the next year. But we grow it here in Utah. You can definitely grow it in Arizona and New Mexico and Texas,
Yeah.
especially, and California, Southern California, and all these other places. So, and you can also grow it in pots inside because they don't get to be terribly big, to be perfectly honest, and you're constantly stripping them of their foliage.
Yes. Yeah.
So
It's easy. It really does just grow. I mean, if you give
yeah,
it, if it doesn't freeze, it just
yeah,
grows. It's easy. It's a friendly one.
it is. Yeah, and it's probably one of the most important plants. Like if there is only one plant that I could tell people that you need, it would be cannabis. But if there is 2 plants that I could tell people that they need, it would be cannabis and moringa.
Yeah.
And I think that between those two, people can get a majority of their food and medicine needs actually.
All in one.
Yeah, all in one, like, well, all in two, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah.
So
the sacred marriage.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I've got a bunch of other tags on there, like, newly released and a few other things. Every single month we release. So just today, I think earlier today, we sent out the monthly newsletter with 5 new products on there. I couldn't actually tell you what those 5 new ones were this month because I haven't looked at my own newsletter here. Nori takes care of all of that for us. But, those are always on the featured products page, along with any other products that are kind of new or really hot or trending at that present moment. And I don't mean trending in that people are buying them, but trending in that they're necessary based on the trends that are happening in the world today. So like liposomal vitamin C, Mumio,
I see you have the COVID stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then we've also got the moringa clysis without glycosides and moringa clysis with glycosides on that featured products page, I think. So, those are always the things that are like 20% off or more on that page. And there's always 5 products that are always 20% off. The 5 products that we release every month into the Apothecary, they always are 20% off for the entire month, no coupon necessary. So, that's...
and the peer-reviewed stuff that you're constantly working towards as well, right? The
IDF stuff, yeah.
IDF stuff.
So that's, I'm working for peer review on a few different angles actually, but with the IDF work, what I'm trying to do is I'm actually training a person in Greece right now who will be able to do and take the same readings. We've already played around a little bit and we're within like a point or 2 of each other. Which makes sense actually for the interferences that were detected inside of our system. We've been able to see it. So we're already getting really close to peer review with at least one other individual. And I've got another couple in Arizona who are looking at buying the SE5 and getting trained by me in order to use it. And so I'm slowly building up a research society of people besides myself just doing research. And as we transition from just an academy to a society, I think that people will begin to see some really awesome information, because if I publish things right now, it's very anecdotal. That's the way that it is if it only comes from one person. But once we get data coming in from multiple individuals with case studies that echo the very same concepts or the very same approach, now we have a little bit of peer review, and we have people who will be able to write articles and also approve those articles and say, based on my experience, this is true or this isn't true. And that's equally as valuable information. So right now, I mostly discuss my case studies with a lot of my students and clients and things like that. And I'm just compiling lots of that data right now. And within the next year or 2, hopefully we'll be able to hire another data analyst to go through the data and publish the data and give it back to me in such a way that I can write a narrative about it so that we can start publishing it. But one of the most important things that we're working on right now is taking every single product that's in our apothecary, and we've come up with this huge list of things that that plant or that spagyric might be good for, and its qualities. So for instance, does it correspond to, in Chinese medicine, does it correspond to metal or to wood or to earth or to fire or to water? Does it correspond to in the Aristotelian, does it correspond to fire, water, air, or earth? Does it correspond to all of these things? And then also on top of all of that data, is it good for this condition? Can it be used successfully for this condition, for this condition, for this condition? And that will be the first intrinsic data field data, or really any inquiry into what each type of spagyric pharmacopoeia from a particular plant is good for. And also the first time that we'll be actually searching objectively for what's in its intrinsic data field as being that particular remedy's planetary ruler or constellational affinity. And we will be able to compare that data with the planetary and constellational affinity of the raw herb in the future as well, so that we'll be able to see, like, okay, well, when we took this herb, it started off with a jovial, or Jupiter influence. And by the time we were done with it, it has taken on a martial influence, and it's good for the immune system and, like the spleen and so on and so forth like that. So yeah, I think that we'll be able to draw some really interesting conclusions that nobody's ever even taken a stab at, and at least publish it and put it out there and see. I'm always encouraging people. It's like, you can do this very same thing in whatever field that you're interested in, or even in the same field. Just go ahead and get started, get your hands dirty, and then reach out to me and be like, hey, here's what I've been doing. Do you have time to research this, or can I see some of your results so that I can peer review them? And right now we're at a very early age and phase of the game to be able to do things like that, because there's so much that needs to be explored. So yeah, it's like things are just ripe and they're really just beginning. And so it's been really amazing working on this path and being able to find out all of the things that I already have, like how I need to make protemia when the moon is at 31 degrees Leo precisely. If I wait any longer than that, then it doesn't have the same effect, because it's partially affecting the astral body, not just working with hypothalamus and monoamine neurotransmitters. And so, I'm constantly getting my mind blown by the data that we do produce, and hopefully this will lend to the corpus of what's to come next. I don't expect it to be the end all be all, but I do want it to be a stepping stone, or at least a springboard for further inquiry to be able to happen in this field by other people who maybe come after me, or possibly, hopefully, also my contemporaries, so that we have the chance to work together.
Yes, it's all very exciting. I'm just so thrilled to see you. You're kind of trailblazing this modern movement, of course, with the people we talked about earlier, Jean Dubois, and this is it's an exciting new renaissance, and we should all be thankful that people out there are like you are trailblazing, and hopefully, like you said, more people will join in. This is what we need to get this rolling, so that we all find a deeper sense of what's going on here in our lives. And it starts with this physical kind of work, whether you're in the lab or not. This is all we need to do, the work on self ultimately.
Yeah.
And by doing this kind of work, we add to the collective. It's a big deal. It's a very big deal.
There's nothing that could possibly be a bigger deal, actually. I think that's the key to all of the work that I'm doing, because I'm finding particular applications, and that's the way I get my funding. But hopefully what people will draw away from the experience of Phoenix Aurelius, when they think of that name, or when they look at my work in the future, long after I'm gone, it will be, man, that guy tried to weave alchemy into our social fabric in such a way that it was just like, you can't take it back out again. And
Yes.
People will know how to process their trauma by using the alchemical process. They'll know how to garden because of the alchemical process. They'll know how to develop societies and new ideas of governmental just ways of being, new systems that haven't even been thought of because of the alchemical process, and taking things from where they're at now and being able to get, take all of the vital elements of it and all of the things that work, and keep everything else behind that doesn't, and find a way to make all that stuff that doesn't work actually feed the system of what does work, so that we can create new things. And if people can really begin to think like that, it doesn't matter what the application is. We're living the alchemical lifestyle at that point.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, everything you just said is alchemical. On every level.
Single part. Yeah.
I am thrilled. Thank you so much. I don't know, Jer, what do you have?
Nothing. We can wrap it up. It's been 2 hours.
It's just been a great honor to have you here.
Completely.
And just such a major deep dive. I know that a lot of people, this is brand new for them. And
if you're feeling cross-eyed, that's a good thing.
But it's a good thing that they're encountering you, because you know what you're talking about and you're out there in the field doing it. And it helps people that are coming up against brick walls. Either they're having ill health, or they're struggling with why, what, and how, and all this other stuff. And so your overall messaging is great, but then you actually have pathways that you present. So it's your intelligence in this should be a breath of fresh air and help people expand and open their minds and stretch into new ideas and new modes of operation and health and healing and being. So thank you so much, Phoenix.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
been
thank
great.
you guys. This has been an absolutely fun conversation, and I've really, Nish, appreciated how deep your understanding was about alchemy and how you could kind of wrap on for a little bit. That it really, for me, is doing an interview that made all the difference in the world, because I'm not just, covering the same old ground that I do in all the interviews. We got to talk about some really fun things here tonight, and even if the listeners don't understand it all, hopefully it really just like broke it open. It's like, wow, there's a whole world for me to explore if I want to.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I've not been in the lab, so I've been here. Everyone needs to know this, and anyone that knows me knows I've yearned to do that. That's my next step, actually, is to get into the lab. So I'm working towards that.
That's cool. Well, we've always got places, and hopefully 2021 things, I think after the elections, all of this COVID nonsense will completely clear up. And, even if it doesn't, I think the travel restrictions and other things, like inevitably, you're going to have to get back to business. It's just the way that things work. So, keep an eye out for 2021 and, or even throughout the rest of the year. I've got a few more workshops yet in October and November. So love to have you here.
Great. And
That's
I've got
the
links.
biggest message. I'm sorry. And that is a big message I keep saying, just for people out in the world. There's a lot going on, and I think it's really important to keep making plans and to keep dreaming and moving forward in your life and not stopping here. Yes, a lot is changing, and that's the nature of everything. And so let's embrace that, but don't forget to continue on with plans and moving forward. This is how you get through this. We could throw the definite alchemical analogy around this. Seal the vessel and let's go. Let's just move forward.
Yep.
Jerry, you're saying?
Yeah, I was going to say that basically, he said that he thought after the election it would clear up, and I think a lot of it would clear up quickly if some of these businesses who are getting smashed, the bigger ones, think of the airlines, right?
Oh, yeah.
They're not pushing back on it at all. So when these huge corporations start pushing back on it, going, "Hey, you're killing us here," that's when I think it'll start to ease up.
Yeah, exactly. You can have whatever kind of approach that you want for why COVID is doing this thing and what a virus is and whatever else, but the actual fact of the matter is that it's financially driven somewhere along the line.
Yep.
And when people put enough financial pressure on the system, the system won't cave because it knows where the money is and that's just how things work. So
absolutely. So I put links to your site in the show notes and the description of this video. Did you have any other things you wanted to plug before we say ta-ta?
Yeah, man. Anybody who's interested, and thank you so much for that opportunity, Jerry.
Sure.
Actually, for anybody who is interested in learning alchemy, I actually have a teachable site with a completely free introduction to Spagyria. I didn't get to talk about Spagyria a whole lot, at least in depth, or even define that on this. But this is basically applying alchemy for making remedies and medicines. And there's an entire pharmacopoeia of Spagyric medicines and Spagyric philosophy that most people aren't even aware of today, but it's equally as potent as traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda. It's just a different approach that originated with Paracelsus. So I've got a completely free course that you can take on my Teachable page, which is the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy. If you just research that on Teachable, or you can get to that through the education page, the online study link on my website. And then if you're really interested in going a little bit further, I give in Spagyria 1010, the other course is currently published on that site. I give lesson 00, which is a full outline of the entire process completely for free. And so you get not only to taste what my education style looks like on those higher ticket items for education, but you also get to actually download a ton of PDF resources and other things like that walk you through in very plain English how to be able to make spagyric tinctures yourself and kind of outline some of the processes and materials that you might need. So
that's cool. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. It was wonderful meeting you and talking to you. and hopefully come back sometime, maybe for a Nox Mente. It's our other show.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. Nox Mente would be like a mental night, or like a
Night mind.
Night mind. Yeah.
Yeah, the show's all about dreams. We just ask you about your dreams.
Oh, and consciousness
Consciousness
exploration. Yeah.
Oh, that's super rad. Yeah, let's definitely do one. You guys just go ahead and get in contact with support, and we'll be in touch. It's been a pleasure chatting with you both.
Yes, thank you so much
for this opportunity.
Yep, and thank you everyone for listening. It's been a great evening. Please like this video if you like it, and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're listening out there on podcast land. And I guess that's about it.
Next week, Jer.
Next week we have, I was getting to it. Next week we have a Nox Mente with Tom Ross, who's Keats Ross's dad.
Oh yes, transhumanist.
He's a transhumanist advocate.
Yes.
So can't wait to talk to him. That's a Nox Mente show, so it'll all be about dreams, not so much. Yeah. What? All right.
I heard that. That wasn't me, Jerry. I think it was your cat.
No, it wasn't my cat. My cat's right.
Did we have a little gremlin of some sort?
I think we had an EVP.
Did you hear that, Phoenix?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I think it's the homunculus in the corner. Right?
Oh God, that was so weird.
It was very strange.
It's funny because this Friday, Josh and I have rescheduled finally for our ghost hunting. So we're supposed to go Friday night. Yeah. Excellent. We're going to the Altoona Civil War battleground on Friday night, like at midnight.
Yeah. Oh, that'll be fun.
So I'll have my digital recorder. We'll get some EVPs. Anyway, that's all I got. Thanks so much, everybody. We love you. Good night.
No, bien, though.